Evening and welcome. Tonight, I have the honor of introducing what I know will be a fascinating and very important conversation between two brilliant writers and thinkers on the eve of an historic date. On June 19th, 1865, 156 years ago tomorrow, and more than 2 years after President Abraham Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation, Union Army General Gordon Granger announced the end of legalized slavery in the state of Texas. Since then, this day has been commemorated and celebrated throughout the United States as Juneteenth, a holiday recognizing African American liberation from a terrible and shameful institution, the damage from which continues to be felt across our society to this day. The events surrounding Juneteenth are at the heart of Annette Gordon Reed's new book, On Juneteenth. The book is, at once, an indispensable historical account of the holiday's complex origins and a candid personal story of Reed's upbringing in Texas. This evening, Professor Reed, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and professor of history at Harvard University, will discuss her book. She'll be joined in conversation by Brent Staples, himself a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer for the New York Times and a member of the Times editorial board. We're truly lucky to welcome them both here tonight. As many of you know, throughout our history, the 92nd Street Y has sought to be a place where we can gather, create community, share ideas, and learn in order to advance and improve society. In connection with this, we have, throughout our history, not only celebrated what we as a country have done right, but we have also examined our failures so that we can do better. In the years since George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis sparked a renewed national conversation about racism and a new push for social justice in our country, we felt the importance of this commitment more deeply than ever. We recognize that while conversations such as the one we're about to have tonight represent an important part of the process of national reflection and self-improvement, much more work remains to be done. We are committed to continuing to play a role in this process until such time as our nation's ideals and its reality match up. And now, please welcome Annette Gordon Reed and Brent Staples.
Good morning, Annette Gordon Reed. Good to see you. And it's been some years since we've shared a stage together. I reckon it's been about at least 20 years, right?
Oh, I think it can't have been that long ago. It can't have been that long ago. We've been at the New York Historical Society, but it's been a while. Yeah, it has been a while.
What year was Hemming's book?
2008. So we would have been on 2009, okay. But we've done some, yeah.
So it hasn't been that long. So, yeah. Well, I have to tell you, I was really absorbed reading your recollections of growing up in Texas in the context of the Juneteenth book. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I was really absorbed by that. And first of all, just to set the stage for the reader, when we talk about Juneteenth, we're talking about the day of June 19, 1865, was the day the enslaved African Americans in Texas were told that slavery had ended. Mm-hmm. 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, and just over 2 months after Confederate General Lee had surrendered. Mm-hmm. You talk about, in this book, having a proprietary feeling about Juneteenth, about initially being sort of a little annoyed, find that it was celebrated outside of Texas. Say for the reader, what is the significance of Juneteenth in Texas versus the rest of the country?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a holiday that I grew up with that was sort of a precursor to July 4th. Think of the July 4th with Black people, barbecue, family gatherings, kids with firecrackers, all the kinds of things you do with a celebration. And when I was growing up, it was largely something that was celebrated by Blacks. It became a state holiday in 1980. And even before then, local news stations and so forth would sort of broadcast and talk a little bit about it. But now it's a holiday in Texas that's celebrated by, Black and white people do celebrate it alike. But it was something growing up that I thought of that made Black Texans in particular unique. Now, some people say, well, you know, why would you want to be unique in that way? Just finding out a couple of years after, although people knew what was going on, but officially finding out that slavery was over. But what it was that this was something that belonged to us. It was a way that we were different from others. And so I at first felt that this was something that was a Texan thing. And then I realized that there, you know, it belongs to everybody. There is no, as you know, there's no one day that you can look at and say, okay, this is when everything became okay and slavery was over. I mean, you might point to the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December, but nobody really knows that. That is so it isn't something that has taken on a national, any kind of national, you know, role in the consciousness of people. But Juneteenth has. I think there are only like, I think I read recently, only 3 states that don't have some form of a recognition of it. So yeah, it from being proprietary to saying, okay, this is symbolic of African Americans, a part of the African American experience.
As you weave your growing up story in which is Conroe, Texas, weave your growing up story into the story of Juneteenth, you talk about encountering the vestiges of Jim Crow in your childhood life. And one of the things you mentioned is going to the doctor's office and still having 2 entrances, one for colored and one for white. You look over and you notice that, I think this is right, you notice that the white waiting room has more reading material.
Yes.
You know? Yes. Talk a little bit about that. I mean, the vestiges of Jim Crow in your childhood life. And also, this is kind of a juxtaposition here. I mean, you speak in this book of your love for Texas, you know, and how do you juxtapose those two? I mean, that sense of how Texas resisted Black emancipation more vigorously than any other state. And the evidence of that was even in your childhood. You know? And you talk about still loving Texas and how that's working.
Well, when I was, the scenes that I'm talking about are in the 60s, the mid 60s, and the South, not just Texas, but the South. Texas is part of Southwest, but part of it. And we're still resisting all of the efforts to desegregate. And when I went to the movies, we sat in the balcony. Black people sat in the balcony, and the separate waiting rooms, I don't think that they were marked. We just knew which ones where you were supposed to go, essentially, because it was that deeply embedded in the culture that you really didn't have to, I don't think you had to say it in a small town, in a relatively small town like that. I guess if you say, how can I love Texas when those things happen? The only way that for me not to is to concede that Texas belongs to other people and that somehow we were visitors there, or we are denizens, aliens there, and this place that belongs to these other people is not treating you well. My Texas consisted of my mother and my father and my family and my community and friends and the people that whom I knew who were Texans, who were as much Texans as anybody else who was walking around there during that time period. So what I love about it is the sum total of all of the things that went into making me the person that I am, and all the people that I loved there and who loved me. Those experiences make Texas for me. And the fact that there were these people who were hostile, well, that was their problem, and it's not their state. And there's long been a struggle in Texas, and it's still a struggle between people who have differing visions of what Texas should be. And it's a struggle that's, I guess, played out in the United States as well, certainly, about who belongs, who can be a part of the people. And it's a struggle that we've been waging. So that's how I love my Texas. I love the Texas that I know, and it is as real as the Texas of cowboys and the West. And I say in the book, Texas, for many people, is constructed as a white man, but not everybody who lives in Texas is a white man. And it doesn't make sense to let that vision of the state control everybody's lives. So yeah, so that's what it is. It's not a contradiction. It's only a contradiction if you sort of at some level concede that the state belongs to other people. And I'm not willing to make that concession any more than to say that the United States belongs to one group of people.
We talk about, of course, Texas is so much in the news of late.
Yes. Yeah, I didn't plan that, but
passing all kinds of restrictions on what can be taught and not taught, and into a kind of open political denial of slavery, of race and racism in the states past. The parts of the book in which you talk about taking history classes in 4th and 7th grade and having a formative experience with, I guess, we can talk about the absence of non-white people in the Texas history. I guess I was reading the essay in the Atlantic recently that you focused on the enslaved explorer Estebanico, who was a translator for Spanish explorers in the Southwest. And you say there that it would have been salutary for you as a child to have learned that Estebanico was a translator, a user of languages who helped these people survive in the Americas. And you talk about the story of Black people. And it's a very powerful thing you say. You say Estebanico was part of a cohort of Black people who were here long before slavery, and who situated themselves in the New World in a broader story. Tell us a little bit about that and how the evolution of your views on that as you grew up.
Well, Estebanico, many of the people of African descent who came with the Spanish explorers were enslaved, and some of them were not. He was, but when it's an interesting point, once all the laws and the force and all of the culture that goes around slavery were stripped away, and they were stranded in Texas, and they had to make it through with some indigenous people who enslaved them and for whom they had to escape.
Yes.
All of those, whatever power, whatever relations existed before then had to change because they had to survive. And he apparently was skilled at languages and was able to help them maneuver, walking across Texas, walking across Mexico, almost reaching the Pacific Ocean, but coming there to the Pacific seaboard. And some of these other people, not him, but other people who came, left these expeditions. They went into Mexico, they went further down into Central America and South America, started their own. There was a community in Veracruz. These were Black people of African descent in this area doing things other than working on plantations. This is not to say that I'm not putting down, I'm not saying that there was not creativity and all those kinds of things all over and all the things that they were doing, but there were different things. And my point in that was just because the English won North America, the part of North America we live in, that doesn't mean that we don't have a connection to the people who speak Spanish, the people in Haiti who spoke French, whatever. What they had in common was that their ancestors were brought from Africa to the so-called New World to be enslaved under a system of white supremacy, of racialized slavery. So we have that in common. Whether we can speak the language or not, people treated people of African descent in a particular kind of way, and there are particular perils. So what I'm arguing for is to think of 1619 and to think of British slavery, certainly, but to recognize that the Black people who were in St. Augustine in Florida in the 1500s people like Estebanco, people who went down into Central America, are part of the story of Africans in the New World. And we should be connected. I think today, Black people, young Black people should know, and white people as well, should know that these connections are more extensive, more varied, more complicated than just a story of people picking cotton on a plantation, which is essentially what people think, what many people, not everybody, we know we're much better at this now, but what people have traditionally thought of in a very, of enslaved people in a very limited way, and Blackness in a limited sort of way as well. I mean, I talk about people being surprised that Black people can speak another language besides English, which is really silly if you think about it, but the surprise, William Jennings Bryan, in the N-word speaking French. It's like, it was, wow, isn't that amazing?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I have some Black Latino friends who encounter that quite often, even in New York City. When they
what are you doing?
But the powerful thing, the powerful story that you're summoning up here is the potency and importance of origin stories, and how the state of Texas and America generally have set aside the Black origin story in favor of a white storyteller's tale of all these places. The origin story of Texas, first of all, I would say that you are such a careful historian, and I appreciate reading the care you take to make distinctions. But I'm not a historian, but I just play. I play one in the New York Times. So I'm not under the constraints that you are.
Yeah. Okay.
I will disagree with you.
This is the wind up. Okay.
I'll disagree with you on some points.
Okay. Good. That makes it interesting.
For in 2019, there was found in Sugarland, Texas, was digging for a high school, and they found a graveyard of prison laborers. Yeah. And these people had all kinds of injuries, and some of them had been born in slavery and then imprisoned and used as rented out in sugar fields, which is actually brutal work. Yeah. And
Imperial Sugar Company.
Yes, and as the last person who remembered those graves died, it was forgotten and built over, and so that's sort of the metaphor of Black people in Texas, how they were the basis, the basis of material wealth in the state, and how that was quickly forgotten. And by the way, if I were wealthy, I would in fact buy a copy of this book, one for every Texan. and would in fact mail it.
Mail them to them.
To every Texan. But for you, you capture this well. Describe your coming into the true origin story of Texas, of being a child in the 4th grade or 7th grade and having these absences, and then sort of coming into that awareness of the richness of the history and the fact that Texas itself, and this is where I essentially disagree with you, I think Texas rebelled against the rulership of Mexico because of slavery, period, full stop.
Oh, but I say that. I say that. You said, no, I have to, the historians, you're right. This is the historian part of it. Don't want to be what is called monocausal, saying that there's one thing, there's one thing. Now, I think it's the predominant thing. And I say whatever federalism-based issues they had, slavery was the central reason that they left. Okay, but I get your point. I understand. You're saying that this is what's, even when they're talking about federalism, even if they're talking about these other things, at the root of it is slavery. And I don't disagree with that. But the part of it, I have to acknowledge the other things that they mentioned. I mean, this was They spoke a different language. They had a different religion. And whites, I don't know, thought that they weren't sure that people of Spanish origin were really white.
Yeah.
So I would say race and slavery are at the heart of this. But
so as you're coming into, describe your coming into the awareness of the sort of true history of Texas.
Well, as a kid, we take it in 4th grade and 7th grade, as you mentioned, and it's a story that mentions, we talked about indigenous people, the Comanche and Quanah Parker and all of that. And we mentioned slavery in passing, but it was never the connection between the Republic, the creation of the Republic, and slavery was never made. So we're not talking about quibbling about continuums, between me and you. It just wasn't, the connection was not made. And that's not something that I discovered until I was a teenager and off into college, actually, and reading, other history books and finding out about the history of Texas, that from the very beginning, the father of Texas, Stephen F. Austin, gets permission, actually his father, Moses, but who died before he could complete this, gets permission to bring settlers into Texas, Anglo settlers. And the Mexicans wanted them there because they wanted them as a buttress to be against the indigenous people, against the Comanches. They thought that they would be a force to help repel people who were fighting for their territory. And then when it becomes clear that Mexico is against slavery and outlaws slavery, but they're kind of looking at other way for the settlers at this time who are slavers. But there was always this insecurity about what they're going to do. Are they going to try to attack the system? So it became how do you square that? I mean, how do I realize that these people whom I had been taught to admire, Jim Bowie, Davy Crockett, and William Travis. I went to Travis Junior High School. There was a Crockett School. There's a Jim Bowie's, not that many things named for him, but that I know of, I should say. You have to realize, you have to put that aside. You might look at their stand at the Alamo and say, well, yes, they did stand for their principles. They were brave people, but you have to think about what their principles were. And though their principles were antithetical to the well-being and the health and the lives of my ancestors. So I can't think of them the way I was taught to think of them as a child, as a sort of uncomplicated story of valor and bravery. So you have to have a more mature, hopefully a more mature understanding about all of this, to know why some people think they're important and why they mean something in Texas history, but you can't tell their story without telling the other part of it. You can't hide that, hide the truth of the existence of my ancestors in Texas and on my mother's side, at least go back to the 1820s. They're there too. This point I was saying about being in Texas, they're there as human beings in this place. Their lives mattered. So it means that it's complicated. I can't think of them in the same totally heroic vein as, I don't know that, I knew who they were supposed to be, and I understood that they were supposed to be heroes. They were not figures who meant a lot to me growing up, but I understood what they were supposed to mean for Texas. But I can't think of them in that way now.
And you talk about the Constitution of Texas recently, when governor was making some noise about stopping people from teaching about slavery and racism, and a point you made on social media. Well, how can you discuss the Constitution of Texas without discussing that it protected slavery? And you make a distinction, and you talk in the book about Texas writing its constitution, and drawing on the American founding documents, but eliding the part about equality.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a Texas Declaration of Independence, and it basically cribs off of Jefferson's American structure of that, but they leave out, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. They skip that part, have another part of the preamble, but then sort of they follow it pretty much in the same form and structure, except those words that were incendiary, because they knew that whatever Jefferson meant by them, or whatever any of these people meant by them, lots of people took that to heart. African-American people, particularly in the North and in some places in the South, filed freedom suits on the basis of that, thought that it meant something. It made Jefferson a problematic figure for the Confederacy. They actually repudiate him because of that. And even though they like the states' rights part, they don't like the all men are created equal part of the Declaration. Then you get to the Constitution, and unlike the United States Constitution that kind of hides, oh, persons held to service, that kind of thing. The Texas Constitution, as you point out, is they said, we're not going to make any bones about this. Slavery is protected. African-American people can't come and settle here. They can't become citizens here. And this is a slaveholders' republic, which is why Texas was so controversial. Its entry and its annexation and its entry into the Union was a problem, because people in the North or northern states did not want another slave state in the Union. And even overseas, the Republic had difficulty because trading partners overseas were uncomfortable with this idea of the openness of, it's one thing to have the subterfuge, persons heard of service and all of that, but to be bold about it created problems.
How does that initial insistence by Texas that all persons are not created equal, at least by process of elision of that, how does that insistence play out as history unfolds in Texas?
Mm-hmm. Well, it creates and maintains, I guess slavery helped to create and maintain in its own way a racial hierarchy, that whites were on the top and blacks were supposed to be at the bottom. And what that does, of course, in Texas, as it did all throughout the South, was to give whites who were not really on top economically or in any way, something to hold on to, a sense of superiority, that no matter how mistreated they were by the ruling class, at least they were better than Black people. Mm-hmm. And that attitude plays itself out in some ways till this day. You don't get rid of a culture like that, because even if the Texas was relatively new to the Union and but slavery had been there from the beginning. And the people who populated Texas were people from Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi who were coming to the state, to this territory, to make it part of the Cotton Empire. So they had these racial attitudes, these attitudes about labor, but also these attitudes about race from the beginning. And that just continued to play itself out. Reconstruction was brief. We know the history of Reconstruction, and there was a moment when it looked as if they were trying to create a multiracial democracy. I talk in the book about finding my great-great-grandfathers on a voter registration list in 1867, and thinking about what that must have meant for him to be able to say, I am now a part of all of this, and I can vote and determine my representation in my life. And then, of course, it was taken away. A decade later, Reconstruction's over, they pull the troops out, and Blacks are left to the mercy of people who had been their enslavers, who'd never really accepted emancipation. Some of them did, obviously. There were white people who were unionists in Texas. There were white people who said, okay, let's go forward with this. But that was not the majority sentiment. And we were in for hard times.
When you talk about the tributaries to Texas, the people from Georgia, Alabama, elsewhere in the South, I get that. But as a Northeasterner, but by origin, I'm a Virginian.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
You're pretending.
By origin, I'm a Virginian. But there was the people who come, the Anglo-Texans, as you call them, they come there. There's more than just the sum of the parts, however. You have the Georgians and the Alabamans, Mississippians, and the Cotton Empire, but somehow they get there, and it's the assembly is more than the sum of those parts. It seems somehow amplified and bigger and sort of and more self-contained in its own mythologies than other places. Why is that?
Well, it's the West. Here's where the alchemy, this what works there. The Western expansionist frontier. I mean, Virginia is old. Virginia has they think of themselves as an aristocracy or having an aristocracy. The people who are FFV,
right?
They have cards with FFB. Somebody gave me a card with that on one time. It's an old place. It's an old place. In Texas, because it was a frontier, and settling in East Texas, but there was West Texas out there too, and that were settled as well, not more populous than East Texas. I think it's the frontier mentality, the sense that there's law, but it was a particular kind of law. It's not a society with a set aristocracy with an old story about itself, and the newness of it and the youth of it. I mean, if you go metaphorically, it's like a kid, rather than as opposed to an adult. And I think you're right. There's something about and the notion of people who come to a place, right? These are the people who stay are one kind of group of people, and the people who leave are another kind. That to have that sense that you're going to strike out on your own with your slaves in some instances, or you're going to go to this place and make a new place for yourself. It's a different kind of person, and it's just a much more volatile. I think you're right. And when you get there, what I say in the book is that Texas has all of the sort of issues in America run through Texas. Slavery, indigenous people, the Latino Anglo relationship, conflict, whatever you want to call it, westward expansion, a border with another country, all of those things, Jim Crow, all of those things are in that place. And it was a republic. It was by itself for 10 years, and they're very proud of that. And it makes for a very volatile mixture. And that's why in some ways people think that people say it's becoming like America. I think it's always been that kind of wild spirit in some way, maybe describing an American spirit in a way that may make people uncomfortable, that it really is, you're sort of looking at what the country truly is in its essence when you look at Texas.
Yeah, I think that one of the points you make in the book is I had sort of forgotten about that Texas was briefly its own nation, so to speak, and that sort of sense, that sort of proprietary sense, has never left the people.
Yeah.
Now, also, I love that Glenn Campbell song to Galveston. You talk about listening to Galveston. Tell us about Galveston, the centrality of Galveston in the Black Texas cosmology and in your family.
Mhm. Well, it's interesting because growing up, I thought about Galveston mainly as the beach, where people go to the beach and where hurricanes come ashore. That in Corpus Christi. I had heard from my mother that my great grandfather used to go to Galveston to work on the docks there. They had a farm in East Texas, and my grandmother, they had three daughters, and their sons had died as boys. And when he would go, he would hire people to work on the farm, and he would go to Galveston. He could make enough money to pay people and still come out ahead from the money that he made working on the docks while they were whatever, after they planted things, and he could go off and work. So that was all I knew about Galveston in my family. And Galveston, before Houston, Galveston was the most important city in Texas. I should have figured that because it's the port. It was a port. Houston has a ship channel now, and that sort of changed afterward, and then it became the big city. But Galveston was a place where it had a good black, a good number of black people who lived there. It was for Texas, cosmopolitan place. The black people who lived there were known to be the phrase people would have used white people would have used would have been uppity. They thought a lot of themselves. Jack Johnson was from Galveston. Someone told me Barry White is from Galveston as well. I didn't know that. That's less. That's less historic, but that was the idea. Well, I guess it's historic for my purposes, but sure. It was a place where black people. It's an urban area where black people were freer. The black people who got involved in the Republican Party, George Kirby, Norris Cooney, were in Galveston. And Galveston was the place where Gordon Granger comes to give the order, General Order 3, about the end of slavery. So Galveston has a place in my family life that I actually would like to try to go back and find out more about, because during the research for this book, I discovered is not the word I should say, I found out that there was a union of black dock workers. It was a big deal. It was a big political place. And I'd like to go back and find out more about. There have been books written about it, but I would like to go back and find out more about what was going on there. I'm fascinated by the idea of black people working under the kinds of conditions that they were working under, under extreme oppression, but nevertheless kind of finding little ways to maneuver amidst all of that. And it's a place that I think should be better known for Black history, because people like Cooney, who became a legislator and was involved politically with the Republican Party, the Union League down there, to find out what those guys were doing to try to make Texas a better place for African American people.
Do you think, is there, this may not be true, but is there kind of a Black Texanness, because,
I would say so.
Because there's a Black Detroitness, there's a Black Chicago-ness, there's definitely a Black Virginianness, but is there a Black
I think there's a Black Texanness, and it's made up of people who have sort of taken all the influences of Texas, of Hispanic culture. It could be a part of it in the food, in the music. You can listen to the music. There's a feel to it. It's hard to describe, but it's sort of country urban in a way. It's a mixture of that kind of thing. It's that the sense of a connection to land, a sense of connection to a particular kind of cuisine. Those things make Black Texans. Now, you say they're Black Virginians and so forth, and there are variations on those themes, and we would recognize it. I mean, there would be points of commonality between all of them, but I think there's definitely that a sort of a style that's grown out of, like Houston is the big city, but Houston is made up of people who've come from small towns,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and still go back to small towns, still have family in small towns. It's not urban in the way that New York is, for example, I would say.
How, if you were, let's just say, you know, that the rich Brent Staples, the mega rich Brent Staples, would send your book, and that, and let's just say I could maybe tune everyone's television in Texas
Mm-hmm.
to an hour with Annette Gordon-Reed.
Mm-hmm.
What kinds of things would you say if you could capture the entire audience of Texas for an hour?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that it's a big state with tremendous resources and that there's enough for everybody. And that I would hope that Texans, and I would say white Texans who feel like this,
Mm-hmm.
would understand that it's not a zero-sum game,
Mm-hmm.
that we could all prosper there, we could all vote there. Black people, do not, it's not been my experience or belief that Black people want to hurt white people or exact vengeance against white people for what has happened. Black people in Texas and around the country, I think, want just an acknowledgement of what has happened.
Mm-hmm.
And we have always been willing to do our part and to pitch in and to work and to be valuable citizens. But we want this on terms of equality, the terms that were mentioned in the general order, number 3, that we were supposed to be in a state of absolute equality. And that means that we have a right to aspire and have a right to movement, have a right to live. I think there's so much promise in a place that has rich farmland, rich mineral resources, rich intellectual resources in the people. If we could just get past the idea of a hierarchy, that them versus us, that's partly what I would say. And I think that's what the sort of the message of the book, in a sense, and what I'm trying to suggest is that it's possible, even though I left Texas, I got married and I'm married to a Californian who likes Texas, but I have a feeling if once we leave the East Coast, we probably will end up in California, much more likely. Mm-hmm. There's a lot to offer, and we just get rid of the, Texas is opposed to this. The funny thing about all of the stuff that's going on now in Texas and other places as well, they're not the only state that's passing all of these laws, is that Texas is supposed to be about the future. And one of the things that I have noticed, and I was referring to what I said before, is that in the Deep South and other parts of the South, I see much more an adherence to the past and the glories of the past. And we do that a bit in Texas, but mainly the idea is that we're supposed to be forward-thinking people. And I would want people to get, as I said, do away with the notion of a hierarchy and let Texans of all colors thrive.
So I'd have to make this a 2-hour speech because I would want you to really give them a thorough history lesson about what.
What's happened? Oh, well, that I'd give them the book. No, yeah, I'd give them the book. I'd give them the book and say, look, people, get over it. I mean, the Republic of Texas was a slaveholders' republic. And just because of that, these may have been your ancestors, but you're not hostage to what your ancestors did. And you understand what they were trying to do, but they were wrong. And now we don't have to live by that. But yeah, no, 2 hours, I would give them a history lesson. I'd talk about that.
Now, I think some 20 years ago, I was looking at some column I wrote 20 years ago, and I think we mentioned you in it. When we talk about origin story of the United States, and that's, like I said, it's a very powerful theme in which we're writing about the potency of origin stories, how they allow people to imagine who they want to be and where they see themselves going.
Yeah.
the actual origin story of the United States has undergone, in my opinion, a great expansion over the last 20 years. Sometime in the early 2000s, I wrote that there had been more books about slavery, for example, written in the previous 10 years than in all of American history. And they keep coming. And so we're seeing more and more about gender in slavery, about economics in slavery. And we're reinterpreting some things that were told to us from a skewed point of view. And you're a part of that. I mean, your work in the 90s forward is a big part of that. Do you see, how do you see the American origin story has changed over the last 20 years or any particular period you wish to choose?
Well, just as you said, it's a more expansive story. It's not just about, well, certainly not just about the Pilgrims. It's not just about Jamestown. It's not, I think what the move now, the big move now is something that Karen Wolf down at the Omohundro Institute talks about, vast early America. And that is in some ways almost decentering the United States as the point of everything. That in fact, this was a part of a system, of an Atlantic system, people moving across, back and forth across the Atlantic to the Caribbean, to South America, all of these things, and also bringing in the western part of the United States. I mean, the Spanish were in California. There were things going on in other places besides just colonial Williamsburg, and or Charlottesville or Philadelphia even. So I would think the thing that's happening, it's sort of like what I was talking about before with Estebanico, is realizing that these people are all connected to one another. And they had contact with each other, slaveholders, enslavers in Virginia and in the South, or in contact with the Caribbean. And if they're in contact with them, enslaved people knew stuff that was going on. They transmitted information. I mean, one of the things about Juneteenth is that before Granger even gets there, the enslaved people knew what was coming because they were talking about it, and people would mention that people knew something was happening. So I think the biggest point is not to have the United States just at the center of everything. And the new origin story is much more capacious understanding of origin and how this thing gets started. It's all of these people in different places who are reacting to the changes wrought by travel, by the capacity to move from the old world to the new world, or through the worlds, because the new world obviously was a world before Europeans got here. So yeah, I think that's what it is, vast early America that's not just centered on the Eastern Seaboard.
So, but as we see these two currents, I mean, we have this swift and rich expansion of the story, of the origin story. And it's being countered at this time by a kind of resistance at the government level.
Yeah.
Any letting go of the narrow, tendentious version of that story, the propagandistic version of that story. So is that just a natural conflict, or is the expansion going to win out soon? I mean,
well, again, not being a historian, not want to predict, but if I had to predict, I would say the expansion would win out. I think what we're seeing is reaction, and it's not surprising, because if you tell a story a particular way, if I told stories to my kids, if I got tired and I skipped over something, they'd say, "Wait a minute, that's not no, you got to come back to this." People want comforting stories, but the information is just too rich. It's too rich. There's too much out there. It's like I was saying about the Constitution. How on earth are you going to talk about the Texas Republic without talking about the provisions in the Constitution that talk about slavery and talk about race? You know, there's this tendency to think that we're now fixating on race. You know, all you want to talk about is race. But that's what they talked about in the past. It was there. It was in the laws. They were obsessed with it. They had whole codes about it, sections about it, who can sleep with whom, you know, what status people have, all this kind of stuff. It's always been there. So I would say that barring some sort of mass hypnosis or whatever, the expansion will out because there's just too much there. It's in the documents themselves. Unless they're going to say we're not going to read documents anymore. Mm-hmm. We're not going to look at the past anymore. But if that process keeps going, it always fits and starts. There will always be reaction, and we'll react back and say, no, this is for real. It's not a joke.
Well, it's interesting too the role that historians are playing in this, and Black historians in particular. Mm-hmm. My late friend John Hope Franklin, who I met when I was just a tyke mm-hmm. in Chicago, mm-hmm. and I was young in my 20s and used to be really impatient with him. Mm-hmm. because he was
as people in their 20s often are.
because I wanted, it seemed too measured, for me, and it was too careful, but I've come to appreciate that. Also, I would just like to share with you briefly an experience. Several years ago, I was summoned to Virginia, the Old Dominion, mm-hmm. because the small town where my paternal family is from was clearing some ground to make like an Arby's or some food court. Mm-hmm. And they discovered the graveyard at the edge of my family's plantation. Oh. And some of my white cousins went to court to stop the town from tearing up the graveyard. Mm-hmm. And so they looked up the New York Times and they brought me down, and I ended up being the expert witness on and one of the lawyers said to me, he said in the court, he said to the judge, he says, why is Dr. Staples a witness here? And I said, well, I'm related to the white people and the Black people in that graveyard. Mm-hmm. And I said, also, that makes me a real son of Virginia and makes my story a Jeffersonian story. So basically, it's just like, for me, I'm sitting there in a courtroom and I'm thinking to myself, my slave ancestors are buried all around here. Mm-hmm. But, I have become the spokesperson for them, mm-hmm. and also not just for them, mm-hmm. but for that section of history.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so I see you doing that in all of your work, and on Jefferson's, mm-hmm. And in this Juneteenth book as well. But just to double back for a second, do you think of this period as like Reconstruction? I mean, as like the collapse of Reconstruction right now? Is that a good parallel or not? For the way suddenly the achievements of Black people, independent, emancipation, generates reaction, and then suddenly we have this sort of vote suppression and that whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's sort of like it. I mean, we historians know that it's no two periods are ever exactly alike, but the idea, white supremacy doesn't change, doesn't go away. If it hasn't gone away, and the responses to Black achievement are predictable. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're very familiar. You see this, and the notion of the purity of the vote and the ideas about fraud, all those were the same things that they were saying in the 1860s and 70s. I mean, it's the similar complaints. And it stems from the idea that a notion that African American people are not really legitimate Americans, right, in a way. And I mean, they know by law we are, but the feeling is of us as being outsiders. And whatever we do, when we participate and are effective, particularly when we're effective, we are illegitimate. So it puts you in mind of that, the reaction that comes from the attempt to claim equal citizenship by African American people.
Just one of the other fascinating things you say, I mean, you say a lot of fascinating things in this book, but you talk about, you know, the announcement that slavery and theoretically equality are at hand.
Mm-hmm.
And you just a little aside here where you say that there are places in Texas where Black people could have exacted a fair amount of vengeance against their former slave owners and did not. Could you dilate on that a little bit for me?
Well, it was interesting to me, and people remarked upon this. I mean, the whites who were down there remarked upon this, the lack of seeming rancor. And I think it was just that they wanted to get on with their lives. You know, okay, this is something that happened, and now we're going to go forward. There's a pragmatic aspect to this, because sure, in that particular area, they could have exacted a lot of punishment, but they knew there would have been retribution they know that they're outnumbered in most places in Texas. Texas is not Mississippi, and in terms of the population of Blacks. But for the most part, the reports were that people just wanted to get married. They wanted education. They wanted schools. They wanted political participation. They wanted land and a farm. They wanted to get on with their lives, not create more turmoil and fighting and hatred. And that's, some people think that that's a good thing. Some people say that's a blessing and a curse. That you should be more angry, you should be more violent, you should be more determined to exact retribution. But there's no evidence that that's what they wanted. They just wanted their churches, their land. They wanted schools, marriage. They didn't want their families sold anymore, and wanted to go forward because they were hopeful. They thought that it was going to be a new day, and that was enough, rather than sparking and starting another war. But the whites in the community, many of the whites in the community didn't feel that way. They wanted retribution for their lost property. So there was a lot of violence that was unleashed against the freedmen. They were the ones the people who lost property were the ones who exacted,
property being persons.
Property and persons, who they were the ones who wanted a war of violence to continue, and they did it by killing Blacks at will, whipping people who celebrated, that kind of thing. They just wanted to be left alone. The freedmen wanted the future. They wanted a better future and wanted the conditions to have that happen. And because of the racial hierarchy that I've talked about, because of ideas about white supremacy, many whites did not want to leave them alone, didn't want them to have that.
And as we move forward into this peculiar period that we're in Texas right now, the rest of the country, but in Texas in particular, Texas has historically had a huge sway over education in the United States, because they buy so many textbooks.
Yeah.
And the manufacturers, the publishers have to alter.
Yeah.
To hew to Texas's point of view. Do you think that's still like a thing? It's still a factor?
Well, I think it would probably be less so. There are many ways for teachers to make their ideas known other than textbooks. Online material, there are alternatives to that. There are so many ways to teach now, not from just getting a textbook and going through it. It's still an issue. Texas's sway over this is still a problem, but I think teachers now have alternatives, other than the fact that we don't know what's happening with all of these laws, and I'm sure they will be challenged. but I think we have more opportunities to learn and to teach. I do a lot of Gilder Lehrman Teacher Institute things. I've done those over the years. And there are teachers all over the country who are looking for different material and material about slavery, material about race and the founding, all of this. So again, we have the tools to fight back, I think. And I have a feeling people are going to.
Mm-hmm. One of the touching things in this book, when you talk about growing up in Texas, and and you know, basically, I've only been to Texas twice in my life,
Mm-hmm.
and I frankly stay out of Texas.
Okay.
Deliberately, I stay out of it.
Mm-hmm.
But you talk about your parents and their aspirations for you,
Mm-hmm.
and talk about in your small town, driving to see relatives in another small town, driving for 45 minutes for piano lessons. Mm-hmm. And it's a beautiful passage. You say, you know, that this is where your mother's dreams for you took flight. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's roughly what you say. Mm-hmm. That she was envisioning you in that landscape and mm-hmm. trying to put together the elements to make the Annette that she was seeing in the future. Mm-hmm. Do you think of you as a concert pianist in the making, or how does she think?
I thought she thought that might be something that could happen. Mm-hmm. I know she thought I was going to do something. Mm-hmm. When I gave up the piano, there was no, rancor about that. It was just, okay, you've moved on to something else. But she had high expectations of me, not in any kind of way that was, punitive or anything. Like, it was just, I could feel the faith that she had in me. And she communicated that very, very well. So she just had very high expectations of me and thought I might do something, whether it was in Texas or wherever I ended up. Mm-hmm. But I felt that from the very beginning from her.
Well, you also, piano lessons in the 19th century too. These are evidence of refinement in a young lady.
Well, she was a real musician. She was the kind of person who could sit down and play songs that she'd heard. I mean, she knew how to read music and all. She'd studied music, but she could improvise and do all this kind of stuff. I couldn't. I have to have the music there. So she's the real pianist.
And you've recently taken up piano again, haven't you?
Yes, I have. And I enjoy it very much.
How's that going?
It's going well. My teacher, Jonathan Baker, is a great guy, and it's fun doing something that relearning something and getting better at something that doing something that's not easy for you. I mean, writing, those kinds of things. We know how to do that. Mm-hmm. But it's good to put yourself somewhat at the mercy of another person who's trying to teach you other things. And he's very patient and very, very helpful.
And so basically, as this book rolls across the country, give us 2 or 3 messages you want people to take from this. What if you're doing your messaging? What are the 2 or 3 things you want people to take from this?
Well, I want them to have a different vision of Texas. I want them to know that Texas has more to it than just, Texas is not just a white man. Texas is not just cowboy territory. Many of the things that you hear about Texas, there's a reason for it. And you can locate that reason in its past. It's past as a slaveholders republic. Mm-hmm. It's past as a place that had issues, part of westward expansion and indigenous people, and the conflict with Mexico and people of Mexican descent that still shapes the landscape of the state. And I want people to think of Texas in larger terms, that it has something to say to the United States. It's a cautionary tale or a hopeful tale, however you want to put it, about the United States coming to grips with the truth of its past and the necessity to move beyond mythology, and finally, that we're all part of history. I mean, I could tell my story, my family story, through the history of Texas, but everybody could do that. You could tell your family story through the history of Virginia and your origins and your family's origins. And so I want people to think of themselves as part of history, and therefore also part of our present, to be active and to take, if you see injustices, if you see things that can be fixed, to work to do that, to be active people. That's what I want. That's a message that I hope comes from the book.
Just dilate on just one part of that. What is the hopeful part of this story?
The hopeful part of this story is that I have seen changes. You know, I lived in a town where a man was burned on the courthouse square alive in the 1920s. There's a mural of me in downtown Conroe, and a bust of me in downtown Conroe. There are people there who have a different, now there are other problems, and that's for another book, another book together, but I think people are trying to do better. The people who made that happen was, one of the people was a white man who lived in this area, and another of my mother's friends who's a Black woman, but they worked together in ways that wouldn't have happened when I was a kid.
Wow.
And
so you still know people in Conroe?
yes.
Who's
Yes, we sold our family home there just 2 years ago because there was nobody to be there. But my mother's best friend still lives there. She's in her 90s. I sent her a copy of the book the other day. And other of the people who taught with my mother and who knew her are still there. And I go back to visit from time to time.
And where is this mural and this bust? Where are they located?
They're in downtown. There's a park downtown. And
how many people live in Conroe now?
Oh my God. It was about 87,000 people. Wow. And it was fewer than 7,000 when I was growing up. Exxon has brought its headquarters back to that area. And it's listed as one of the fastest, the last I saw, the fastest growing city in the country.
Well, I would say to Annette Gordon-Reed, the pride of Conroe. It's really been great speaking with you. And I really enjoyed the book, and I wish you much success.
Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun. We should do this more often.
I do, and I was so disorganized, though. I was suggesting that we be given the context that we do this live sometime. So the next time we do something, we'll do it not on Zoom, but in front of a real audience.
I would love to do that.
Like, we could do something at Historic Society.
Yeah. We could talk about Virginia too. I love your story. I love your story about your family in the cemetery. That's great.
I had to go, but I walked into the courtroom. They were like whispering, like, "Who is that?" And
he's the descendant.
Yeah, he was the descendant. And then after I walked out of the court, some guy pulled me aside. He says, "Listen to you." And my family, my white family, was called the Lowry, Lowry. And there's a town, small post office named after them. And the actual house where we were enslaved is still extant. It's been continuously occupied since the 1790s.
Wow.
And the slave quarters where my family in particular lived is still there. So that was a very moving thing. And a guy walked up to me, he said, I listened to your testimony. He said, I can tell you have them Lowry brains. So I said, well, I'll take it. This is really great, and I hope to see you again soon.
Great. Thank you so much. Goodbye.